We're fortunate enough to have Gail Patricelli here from the University of California, Davis, to talk about what she's researched, what she's found out with these amazing birds in New Guinea, bowerbirds. So here she is. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so Darwin's theory of natural selection is very powerful in explaining traits like camouflage coloration, as we see in this fish and this insect, and in this female ptarmigan in fall and winter plumage. And of course, the theory explains how this characteristic, this trait, helps animals to stay alive by avoiding predators. But Darwin's theory of natural selection alone has a more difficult time explaining animals like the peacock, where elaborate male traits and behaviors seem to make the male an easy target for predators. And this was such a problem for Darwin early on that he wrote in a letter to a friend that the mere sight of a peacock's tail made him sick. He was a sickly guy, so this was a pretty typical state of affairs for Darwin. But like many things, Darwin himself provided the solution to this problem, which is his theory of sexual selection, which proposes that these elaborate display traits aid in reproduction and that the genes for these traits therefore spread in the population. And one way that these traits can aid in reproduction is by female choice, when females prefer to mate with the most ornamented of males. So in peafowl, there's evidence that females prefer to mate with the males that have the most eye spots on their tails. But in peafowl and in many other species, especially the ones I'll be talking to you about today, the bowerbirds, males don't provide parental care. So females aren't choosing a better parent, a co-parent to help raise their young together. All she's really gaining from the male when she mates with him is sperm. So why then does she bother assessing the eye spots on his tail or any other display traits that he produces? So females may assess male display traits because they convey information about genetic or direct benefits that the female may gain from her mate choice. And there are a number of types of benefits that have been proposed. Genetic benefits means acquiring better genes for their offspring. These can be genes, for example, that encode for a better immune system function. This is often referred to as the good genes hypothesis. Or genes that encode for sexier display traits in her male offspring. This is often called the sexy son or runaway sexual selection hypothesis. And there's also direct benefits. These are benefits that directly increase female fecundity or offspring survival. And so for these in peafowl or in bowerbirds, this may mean avoiding parasite transmission during copulation, STDs and that sort of thing. An alternative hypothesis is that females are assessing male display traits and they're choosy because they are simply being manipulated by the male's dazzling sexiness. So basically the males are evolving traits that just tap into the female sensory system and make the males utterly irresistible to breeding. So there are a number of reasons why females may be choosy about their mates. But courtship doesn't just involve the male sort of unfurling his tail for passively observing females. Courtships are often elaborate and dynamic, involving interaction between the male and the female, and they're often more like a negotiation than an advertisement. And you can see this in a diversity of species here. And in these courtships, males must choose a location for courtship. They need to choose and approach a female without scaring her away. They need to interact appropriately in these counter-positioning, chasing events that often happen during courtship. And they need to produce their most attractive display trait given what might be variation among females and their preferences, and also the market context, what other males are offering. And these are all complex tasks, and not all males do them equally well. And we see this when we study animal courtship in the wild. We often see this. You'll have a male with a great song, great dance, beautiful color patch. But every time he tries to approach a female, he barrels right up to her and scares her away before he can get the chance to show it off. We see these kinds of behaviors in natural populations. So Darwin's process of sexual selection may favor not just the evolution of these elaborate traits like the peacock's tail, but also what we can call social skills, the ability to approach and interact with the opposite sex. And too few studies have examined these social skills because they're very difficult to measure. They involve interaction between two different partners that have complex behaviors. And so they become very difficult to measure. And in order to measure them, we need controlled experiments where we hold one side of the interaction constant and measure the response of the other party. And so today I'll tell you about an experiment where I tried to do just that in a fantastic study organism, the satin bowerbird. So bowerbirds are found in Australia, along the eastern coast of Australia, where the satin bowerbirds are. Many of them are found in New Guinea, the ones that I'll be talking to you about a little bit later. So my study site was a beautiful rainforest, eucalyptus forest valley called Wallaby Creek along the eastern coast. It was an absolutely beautiful place to do this research, despite that we had to live in this primitive shack with no running water or power for up to 6 months at a time. It's a beautiful place to work. And the focus of this work was understanding the satin bowerbird. So this is the satin bowerbird. This is the male satin bowerbird, and bowerbirds build bowers. So this is the bower here, this two-walled structure built out of sticks with a platform of sticks out in front. And that's where males place their bower decorations. And you can see that in this particular species, the satin bowerbirds, males love the color blue. And they use lots of yellow leaves and flowers as highlights. So when there are no humans around, that means lots of parrot feathers and flowers and berries. But when there are people around, you see lots of blue plastic straws and ballpoint pens. They regularly broke into our research cabin and stole all the blue toothbrushes. One of my favorite decorations that I found on a bower was a blue baby's pacifier. So I'm sort of imagining the male plucking it out of the mouth. So males build bowers, and during the breeding season, females assess male display traits. So they fly around the valley, they visit multiple males in their bowers, they'll stand between the walls of the bowers, and the male puts on a song and dance for the female. And they assess male display traits. And there are a number of display traits that are correlated with male mating success. So this tells us that these are likely the traits that females are using to select their mates. Females prefer a symmetrical, well-built bower, and in fact, the same types of bowers that we find attractive are the ones that female bowerbirds tend to find attractive. They prefer males that have more blue decorations, that perform a very vigorous and intense song and dance, and I'll show you a video of that in just a moment, and that perform high-quality renditions of vocal mimicry of local species, and you'll get to hear that in a video clip in just a moment. So females assess multiple male display traits when making their mate choice decisions. There's no male parental care, so males don't help raising the young. So after the female decides who she wants to mate with, copulation happens inside the bower. The female flies away to her own nest, takes care of the young entirely on her own. And that leaves males free to continue courting as many females as possible, but only a few males are successful. So in our study population, our top guy mated with 27 different females during the 7-week breeding season, and he did that year after year after year. So the genetic payoff, the evolutionary payoff, being one of these guys is very large, and that's why there's such strong selection to be these attractive guys. So what happens during courtship? Courtship involves intense displays performed by the male, so these are video stills. The female will stand between the walls of the bower. The male's puffed up. He often dances with some yellow leaves in his beak, as you can see right here. And he flings his wings out, makes a buzzing sound, and runs across the bower platform in front of the female during courtship. And these intense displays are actually quite similar to aggressive displays. So when a male's trying to intimidate another male to get some food, he'll do the same display that he directs towards females during courtship. So they seem a little bit silly to us, but in fact they're apparently intimidating to another bowerbird. And there's evidence that females prefer more intense and vigorous male displays, but they're also often startled by these displays. So they'll sometimes even fly away from the bower during courtship. So males are in a bit of a bind here. They need to display intensely to be attractive, but the same displays may scare females away if he's basically too intense before she's actually ready. So what are females doing during courtship? Females are crouching. So in most courtships, even weeks before they're actually ready to mate with anybody, in most courtships, females are crouching slowly downwards. And we noticed in studying this behavior that as females crouch lower down, they're less likely to be startled by the male display. So there's information there in this crouching signal, which is a very exaggerated behavior that the females perform. So clever males could observe that female signal and adjust their display intensity to avoid threatening females, basically performing their most intense displays when females are crouching and are least likely to be threatened by them. So this is basically our hypothesis, and to test this hypothesis, we needed to manipulate this female signal and measure male response. And to do that, I built a robotic female bowerbird. And you might be thinking this doesn't look anything like a bowerbird, and you're right. I put that inside of a real female bowerbird skin in this state-of-the-art robot fabrication facility in our shack. And this is the finished fembot. So we placed the fembot inside of a bower where the male would naturally be courting the female. So we went out to the male's bower in the wild population, placed the robot in the bower, then I took the remote control, hid in a blind, and could control her behavior. And so we tested males with various rates of female crouching to see how they would respond. So I'll show you a quick video clip here. And the first little clip is to just give you an idea of some of the troubleshooting we had to do to get this thing to work. Oops. You were able to fix that problem. Probably without too much trauma to the beta tester males. This is the finished robot. You can see she looks back and forth. She crouches downward. She fluffs up her wings. And here you can see a male courting the robot. You see a little leaf in his beak. Now vocal mimicry of a kookaburra and a loon's honeyeater. And usually they follow that with mimicry of a crow and 2 different species of cockatoos. And you may feel sorry for this male courting a robot, but I assure you that this male had very few chances to court actual females. So walked away from this thinking he had actually gotten to court them. So don't do that. All right, so what did we find? We found that males modulate their display behaviors in response to robotic female crouching. So basically we looked at how males respond to different rates of crouching, and we found that they tended to perform low intensity displays when the female was not crouching very much, and they increased their intensity. They performed their highest intensity, most vigorous displays when the robot was crouching the most, signaling that she was less likely to be startled. But not all males responded in the same way. There's variation among individuals. So you can see these are 4 different males from our study. You can see that these top 2 males here were quite responsive in adjusting their display intensity, whereas the guys on the bottom were less responsive. And we found that more responsive males, like these guys up at the top here, startled real females less often during natural courtships compared to these kind of guys down here. And when we looked at all of our results taken together, they suggested that the most successful males are those that can produce high-intensity, vigorous courtship displays without threatening females, and that they do this by adjusting their intensity in response to female signals. So performing the signals when females are ready. So this social skill, this ability to assess and respond to signals produced by a female and adjust their display accordingly, as well as the ability to produce this high-intensity, vigorous display, are equally important for courtship success in this species when you compare their importance in determining male reproductive success. So they're approximately equally important. So sexual selection seems to be favoring the elaborate display traits as well as the ability to use them appropriately during courtship. So far we've been talking about satin bowerbirds. What about the other species of bowerbirds? These are the satin bowerbirds right here, looking at the family tree of the group. There are about 20 species, give or take, depending on who you ask. This is just a subset of them. And you can see that there's a great deal of diversity across this group. In the bowers that they build, there's also diversity in the decorations that they use, in the songs and the dances that they perform, and the way that they interact with females during courtship. And we don't have time to go through all of them, but I'll highlight just a few of the more colorful characters in the family tree. And we'll begin with the great bowerbird and then talk a little bit about the spotted bowerbird as well. So the great bowerbird, as you can see right here, builds a larger, more robust bower than the satin bowerbird. And the male has a beautiful lavender crest that he shows to females during courtship, as you'll see. And rather than decorating with the color blue, they like whites and grays in their decor, so lots of bleached bones and stones and snail shells. And I'll show you a quick video clip here. This is kind of ugly footage. These are all very old tapes, so I apologize for the quality, but you'll be able to see what's going on once I start the video. So this is the little infrared beam that triggers the camera, and this is all video, by the way, that was collected by my dissertation advisor, Jerry Borgia from the University of Maryland, who was a collaborator on the work that I told you about earlier. So here's the bower right here. There's the male. You'll see the female enter from the back side of the bower, and here are his decorations. And during courtship, you'll see the male performing a song, which is not quite as melodic as the song performed by the satin bowerbird. And he presents the crest on his head to the female for the front of the bower, as well as a decoration that he holds in his beak. And he moves back and forth along the side of the bower, each time getting a little bit closer to the back side of the bower until he attempts to mate. So this is a very shortened version of a very long courtship. Hard to see it, we have the little stone in the field there. For bowerbirds, or other birds in general, takes for most birds at least, takes about 2 seconds, but that's what they're all working up towards. So clearly a very different courtship, different style of interaction than you saw in the satin bowerbirds. So now let's look at another member of the bowerbird family, the spotted bowerbirds. These guys are kind of the trashy cousin of the bowerbird family, as you'll see. They build this sort of scrappy bower here. They like to decorate it with white and green objects. They use a lot of bleached sheep vertebrae and broken glass. You'll often find rusty nails inside the center of the bower. Here's the male arranging his glass for the female. And you'll see here that the courtship is the least aesthetically pleasing to the human ears. Basically, courtship consists of the male screaming, freaking out, and throwing decorations. The female standing between the walls of the bower, and wisely the female watches courtship from through the wall of the bower, keeping it mainly between her and the male. Very loud and fun. So this is a good time to highlight again that these birds clearly have a very different aesthetic sensibility than we might. So there are many of these species of bowerbirds, like the satin bowerbird and like the 3 species that I'll tell you about in just a minute, where we seem to share an aesthetic sense. The same things that we seem to find beautiful are the same things that the bowerbirds find beautiful. But clearly in this case, it's not terribly aesthetically pleasing to most of us, so apparently it was quite enticing to the female spotted bowerbird. So now we'll look at the other major branch of the bowerbird tree. These are often called the maypole building bowerbirds, as you'll see why in just a moment. And we'll talk about 3 species, beginning with the McGregor's bowerbird, then the vogelkop, and the streaked bowerbird. So this is the bower built by the McGregor's bowerbird. It's quite a small bird, not very large. And this is about 1 meter or more wide and 1 meter or more high. And it's built around a central sapling. And they build this runway of moss around the sapling, and they decorate it with lots of dark black-colored fungus and lichens and things that they collect from the environment. They weave lots of sticks back and forth across the central maypole, and they decorate it with little berries and trinkets that they'll hang from the sticks on the central pole. So this is particularly grainy footage, but as far as I know, this is some of the only footage of what actually happens during courtship in this species. And videotapes, this is back in 1992, videotapes and rainforests often don't mix very well, which is why this is such poor footage. But you can see the central maypole right here, and this is the runway around it, and you'll see the male and female interacting So this is the male, this is the female. The male performs amazing vocal mimicry. These are all the sounds he's producing. The female seems to lead in this counter-positioning game. He also has a crest. So from the female's perspective, she would just be seeing flashes of orange on either side of that central pole. So another astonishingly cool species. And the master builders among the bowerbird are the Vogelkopf bowerbirds. These are all found, the McGregors and the Vogelkopf and the other maypole builders are all found in the island of New Guinea. So the Vogelkopf bower is this amazing hut bower, again over 1 meter wide, with a central pole across the middle and an amazing platform that they clear and decorate with a variety of different objects. Just to give you a sense of scale, this is the little male right here that built this structure. This is basically inside the entryway of the hut, arranging his pile of flowers, which are changed regularly to keep them nice and fresh. This is a pile of the wings of beetles. One of the bowers that my colleague Al Uy studied had a white tube sock with orange stripes on the top that the male had stolen from a missionary's cabin nearby and laid out in a prominent position on the front of his bower. It's very Dada-esque. And this is a bower that is located apparently near some sort of human settlement. So this guy has specialized on collecting garbage and arranging it into a gorgeous work of art. And unfortunately, I don't have very good footage of what courtship looks like in these guys. It happens mostly inside of that hut bower. But I do have some footage from a closely related species called the street bowerbird that also builds a large hut. These guys place their decorations right in the entryway of the hut. And this is the female right here. You can't really hear the sounds that the male's producing from the inside. So you can see that there is a spectacular diversity of bower forms, of decorations, of dances, of social interactions, all favored by this diversity of female aesthetic senses across this family. So is this art? It's an interesting question. And of course there's a diversity of definitions of art. This is just a simple definition that shares many of the characteristics of other definitions I found. The use of skill and imagination in the creation of aesthetic objects, environments, or experiences that can be shared with others. So the creation of aesthetic works that can be shared with others. And absolutely by this definition, then bowerbirds are indeed producing art, and theirs is a performance art. Males are interacting with the works that they produce, and they're interacting with the audience during the performance. And I think that asking a question like this can be very helpful for us humans in understanding the evolution of our own aesthetic sense and our relationship to the creatures around us, certainly, which is one of the goals of the event today. But is placing other animals into human categories like art or not art helpful for us biologists as we're trying to understand sexually selective traits? And I think the answer is yes. Examining animal-produced art or even bodily traits. So, for example, these are two other species of bowerbirds. This is the flame bowerbird and the Regent bowerbird, both of whom have absolutely spectacular plumage. So in that case, they're born to be beautiful. They're not producing these plumage traits in the same way that they produce a bower or decorations. In this case, you would say that the artist, arguably, is the female who has, by selection over long generations in time, been creating and shaping these beautiful males. So by looking at these traits with an artist's eyes, certainly can lead to new insights into our shared aesthetics. And exploring this idea is another of our goals today. But it is important to do so cautiously. So we need to be careful and consider what Jacob van Uxkol, one of the early founders of the field of animal behavior, called the Umwelt, or sensory world of the animal, the sensory and cognitive world of the animal. Non-human animals may view the world with very different sensory systems. We may see, smell, and hear things very differently than non-human animals. They can often see colors that we can't see, or they're unable to see colors that we can see. And they may process this information very differently with their different cognitive machinery. So viewing them entirely through the lens of our own experience can, in some case, be misleading, and it requires caution. It's worth doing, but it just simply requires caution. So I believe that our goal should be to see this beauty through the eye of the beholder, when possible, in trying to understand it as a biologist. And I'm just going to briefly tell you about the work of one of my students, Jessica Jasinski, who is trying to do this, trying to gain a little window into the Umwelt of the peafowl, one of this iconic species that so bedeviled Charles Darwin long ago. And to do that, she has built an eye tracking system, which she trains the females to wear as they're assessing males performing their display. So here's a female wearing a backpack and an eye tracker, wandering around through displaying males. And this allows us to basically see what the female is looking at as she's assessing a male and making a decision. And the results are quite surprising. So these plots here show gaze paths of 3 different females as they're assessing male traits. And as I told you earlier, there is evidence from studies of various populations that females prefer males with more eye spots on their tails, and yet females are rarely gazing at the upper portions of male trains. You've all seen peacocks display. It's an absolutely spectacular, enormous display. And yet females spend all of their time, almost all of their time, gazing along the lower portions of the train back and forth from the male's body. And I'm highlighting this just to bring up the point that animals may assess and gather information from the world in a very different way than we do. I'd imagine that if you put an eye tracker on a human and asked them to look at a peacock's train, we would do it in a very, very different way, certainly assessing the entire train in its complete glory. And so this is one reason why scientists tend to be very reticent to use human categories like art and not art to describe animal behaviors. Though, as I said, I think the interface of our sensory worlds is certainly worth exploring. And ultimately, we're trying to answer the question of what sensory and cognitive processes underlie this shared aesthetic sense across animals, and how this might favor such astonishing beauty that we find in a peacock's tail, in bird songs, in colors, and bowers, and decorations. And we're a long way from answering this question, even in such an iconic species as the peacock. So there's a great deal of exciting work left to be done. And I'll leave you with an image of my latest love. This is the greater sage grouse. This is a male performing a display for a female who doesn't seem all that interested. And I'm flying out tomorrow to Wyoming to stalk these guys throughout their breeding season. And I have a robotic female sage grouse as well. And I also want to leave you with a quote from Marie Curie. I am among those who think that science has great beauty. A scientist in his laboratory is not only a technician, he is also a child, placed before natural phenomena which impress him like a fairy tale. And I bring this up because I think the scientific approach to something like beauty can often seem quite sterile and detached, but I think when you see the scientists presenting their work to you today, you'll see that, in fact, we're all a lot like giddy children in awe of the beauty that we see in the natural world and at our own good fortune in getting to study it. So, thank you.
The Highland tribes don't have much of a lot of carving art or things like that, but they do adorn themselves with a lot of bird plumage. And in fact, that's what I'm often working with Highland art. They use a lot of the birds of paradise feathers. Do you think there's any correlation between that use of plumage and things amongst the Highland tribes with the spectacular kinds of birds like birds of paradise and bowerbirds in New Guinea?
So the point is that the Highland tribes in New Guinea are often adorning themselves with the feathers collected from birds of paradise, and they are absolutely spectacular displays. They arrange them around their face and on various parts of their body and end up looking a lot like a peacock. And absolutely, I mean, these these signals and traits that these birds produce are stunningly gorgeous. And I don't know enough about them to say whether it's mostly males that are adorning themselves, but I believe that it is. And so, yes, this is one case where there is a convergence on a shared aesthetic sense. But as I said, there's also examples like the spotted bowerbird where it's not quite as obviously aesthetic to us as well.
What is the theory about the peacock, the female peacock
Looking across the bottom.
There's no theory?
So why is the female only looking across the bottom? This was one of these results that's very exciting for us scientists, where it almost raises as many questions as it answers. We were stunned. We certainly didn't expect to find that result, and yet it just happened over and over and over again. Females are perfectly capable of looking up. It's not that the headgear is holding their head down or anything like that. They just simply don't very often. So we're still trying to figure it out, but one thing that I think is very interesting, my student went to India to look at the peafowl where they're naturally performing these displays, and she found that when she was trying to find a lek or a gathering of displaying males, she almost always could only see the top parts of their tails. So that's what allowed her to find these males from a distance in order to go study them. And so it's possible that that upper region of the peacock's tail plays an important role in long distance attraction. It's not entirely clear. And it could be that we also find that the visual physiology allows the female to gather information about the entire train, even while focusing her attention mostly on the bottom. So the next step is to do some experiments where she lops off various portions of the male's tail in order to see how that changes her mating decisions and how she assesses that trait.
One more.
Well, if I may, cut to this question. I actually saw this one time, the peacocks doing this, but the male has these sexual organs, and it was very beautiful. They were just pulsing at the bottom of his tail. And I've always remembered this, and when you said this, is it possible that she's looking at his sexual organs?
Across the bottom of his train, you mean? Across the
very bottom, where
Yeah.
his
There are fishtail feathers all the way across the bottom of his train. And she spends a lot of time, not as much time on looking at the body as she does out on the edges of the train. He also has spurs on his legs, and she does spend a little bit of time looking at the spurs. But most of the time when she's out assessing males, she's not even looking at the male. 70% of the time, she's looking all around, which, these old Victorian guys that studied birds like the sage grouse and the peacocks talked about these aggressive males and very coy females. And when I first read that, I thought, like everyone else, that this was just a bunch of sexist old Victorian men coming up with these terms. But when you're out looking at these, you can't help but come to that same set of terms. Most of the time, females aren't even looking at the male, they're looking all around. When he starts shimmering his train, her attention is grabbed. And that seems to hold her attention for a little while. But then when she is looking at him, it's mostly the base just of the train itself. Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
Thanks.